Hi, Aaron. Do you want to just first introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. I'm Aaron. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the current vice president of the Graduate Employees Organization at the University of Michigan. I am a PhD candidate in the economics department.
Awesome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your organizing background or how you got involved in your campaign?
Yeah, so organizing background, I sort of was pretty new to organizing when I joined GEO. I got involved during the Trans Health campaign in 2018. And that campaign was pretty big for this university because the University of Michigan has a history of conversion therapy, of really bad healthcare practices around trans folk. So it was a pretty huge push, and we have one of the more um, trans inclusive healthcare packages across grad students now. Um, and it was really exciting being part of that work, and it sort of pushed me into doing other labor organizing um, in GEO.
Great. So let's talk about the strike that was just, historic and monumental in scale. How did strike organizing get started?
So strike organizing really began in the spring following the sort of onset of the COVID-19 crisis. So there was limited impact bargaining at the beginning around COVID-19 issues that sort of led to extended leave policies, but little more than that. And the formation of the COVID caucus, which was a rank and file caucus, um, really sort of started this escalation because the COVID caucus put together this open letter with early versions of the demands we struck over. Um, and we had around 2,000 signatures, and sort of that marks the beginning of us escalating towards a strike. Now, we didn't necessarily agree that sort of we had the mobilization for a strike back in April due to limitations I think a lot of graduate student organizers recognize with just organizing over the summer. People are checked out, people are not on campus, people are engaged in research elsewhere. So it's very hard to build up sort of the mobilization you need over the summer. So the mobilization continued through the summer, and we started meeting with deans. And the problem with meeting with deans is they'll say one thing and then you ask them to follow up, and turns out they're really not interested in following through with the action items they discussed at the meeting. So those frustrations, along with an impact bargaining process that was far too slow and didn't yield anything significant, sort of further helped us mobilize towards a strike.
Cool. So it seems like it was a rank and file development in a way.
I think it comes down to the fact that unions can't sort of push for things without membership buy-in. GEO strives to be a membership-driven organization, and leadership can't do anything without sort of members backing. So it was a really strong movement that required a lot of rank and file support.
Cool. So what were some of the you already talked a little bit about impact bargaining. What were some of the issues that workers knew or expected that they were going to face if the university pushed ahead without any resistance to their reopening plans?
I think the first issue that came up pretty immediately was transparency, right?
Yeah.
It now has come to light that they didn't have a model, they don't have they didn't have sufficient testing, and they knew it. They went against their ethics board.
Mhm.
But in the beginning of this escalation, we had no idea. Um, and workers were really concerned about transparency and having a seat at the table. So that's one. So transparency and a seat at the table was a major issue where all workers were concerned about. We were concerned about a universal remote option, or the universal right to opt out of in-person teaching, which the university continues to say is unnecessary, but also refuses to give to us, even though conditions on campus continue to depreciate. We also wanted more financial support for graduate students in the form of rent freeze on campus, in the form of extended timelines, and a one-year extension in funding. We also wanted support for caregivers and parents, because the concern is the university is currently still funding its reopening plan on the backs of parents, because they're not willing to expand their childcare subsidy to include alternative caregivers. And even though they did make an extension or expansion, it's still not complete, right? They're still not they're still not providing them the support they would if we were not in COVID. And that's just, I think, out of line. And I think we also wanted support for international students. So the International Center at Michigan did not have a phone line. You could not call them and ask questions. So when ICE and DHS hands down these rulings or sort of new guidelines, there was not a phone number you could call.
Wow.
So, and emails were sometimes contradictory, and really we felt like they needed support, and it's pretty atrocious that it took this long for them to get a phone line and to hire at least one additional staff to sort of help with this. So those were sort of the COVID-related demands. Over the course of the summer, we added policing demands, and we had a pretty ambitious but very much intentionally abolitionist set of policing demands, such as defunding campus security, which is DPSS here, as well as ending the university's relationship with ICE and Ann Arbor police.
Yeah. So it seems like in many different labor situations or the social movements we've seen erupt this year, that COVID was sort of a catalyst that was able to make explicit some of the other issues that people are dealing with. So when you talk about parents and international students and rent and cost of living, it seems like all of this was sort of just intensified with COVID. But I'm interested in what you just talked about with how policing and the sort of abolitionist horizon sort of became part of this strike. So what exactly did organizers and strikers mean by an abolitionist strike? I've seen that sort of how your strike has been described now by the media.
So again, getting back to this focus on rank and file organizers, I think the push for the addition of the policing demands came from the rank and file. And I think over the course of this summer, it's been open question and something we're still working on as to how to support and center rank and file organizers and make the decision making of this union extremely democratic, especially since sort of traditional union structures sort of may not necessarily be the most democratic things. So it really came from rank and file organizers. I think the first people to call it an abolitionist strike were not in leadership. It was sort of a title given to us, and it was something we sought to fulfill. I think a problem that came up, and I think a problem we're open about, is that due to Michigan being a very white university, we did not have that many BIPOC folks working on the policing demands at the beginning, and we didn't have sort of a sense of what would be steps towards abolition we could take in the likely event that the university didn't give us exactly what we wanted. And there was a lot of work at the back end done by the emergency policing, anti-policing caucus and the Black Coalition, to sort of really they shouldered a lot of work at the very end, and we wouldn't have gotten sort of a sense of what was important to get without their work. And so I think there's a huge debt to them with sort of really bringing these demands across the finish line. And I think going back to this question of like, how is this an abolitionist strike? I think for me, the moment it became abolitionist was when we were offered demands we were offered a package at the end of the first week that included marginal movement on all of these COVID demands, or some of them, some symbolic, some just like were ignored, and no movement on policing. And the question was, do we let the policing demands fall by the wayside, or do we put our money where our mouth is and we show up and we turn down a deal that, some people have described as, holding parents and international students hostage to get the union to turn its back against, BIPOC workers on this campus. So I think the rejection of that initial offer was really important for us to making sure that our strategy and our focus of this strike was sort of trying to forward the work of Black organizers and Black academics, and in service of their research and work, and trying to push for abolition. Does that make sense? Was that long-winded?
I mean, that's just remarkable to me, because usually, on the one hand, we usually think about, rank and file demands and leadership's, like you said, ability to step up and continue that work and guide it in a sense. But then, when we talk about more like quote unquote radical, politics within the labor movement, there's always the inevitable question of like, what if membership actually isn't there? Or like, what if these ideas are coming from one segment of the rank and file, but another isn't actually like ready to go on strike for these things? And here you're describing a situation in which you get an offer from the administration and you reject it on the grounds of those abolitionists or policing demands. So to me, I'm just wondering, like, what kinds of discussions were going on among in these meetings that you were holding and as the strike developed, or on the picket lines, that made it clear that the majority, at least of the of striking workers, were going to say, no, we're in this until we have some movement on these demands.
It's interesting because I think most of those conversations happened around one general membership meeting. So on Wednesday, so 2 days into the strike, so I think backstory, GEO has a history of 2-day work stoppages. So it's unsurprising that the university would give us an offer after 2 days. Okay. Perhaps just some institutional inertia at play. Sure. But I remember we got the call about the offer, and I remember telling the president, I'm not sure what the best move is, because we're not sure if we turn down this offer, if we'll get another one. We had no idea sort of what was moving forward and what that would look like. And I think a lot of people had similar feelings. And then going into that GMM, there was a large discussion of risks. I think we were all very well informed about the risks moving forward. And it was interesting because at the beginning of that meeting, when we did a straw poll, the majority of the people who responded to that straw poll said that they would be willing to accept that offer. And it was interesting watching over the course of speeches, seeing like different group chats I'm in slowly come around to rejecting the offer. And I think you mentioned that there are different segments in the membership, and part of a grad student union is recognizing that there are radicals and there are extremely moderates.
Mhm.
And sort of the struggle is sort of getting them to work together and getting them to fight for a shared goal. And what I found really interesting about this was that I think people recognize that this was a moment and that we wouldn't be able to get policing demands outside of a strike.
Mm.
So why are we not pushing for them now? And it just, I mean, for me personally, and I think for a lot of people I talked to, it felt like accepting that offer would be very racist. And
Mhm.
like I couldn't live with myself
Mhm.
if we like got marginal progress on anything, nothing on policing, and our decision yet again was to drop policing as something that we believed was a public health issue and something that we should be bargaining for. So it was like really this like recognition of like what that decision would mean for us organizationally and personally moving forward, and how that like I don't think you could narrate that decision any other way.
Yeah. So you did mention that Michigan is it's an overwhelmingly white institution. But was there something else about the, either the history or political, economic, or social context of Michigan that sort of elevated policing and anti-racist politics to the center, beyond obviously the Black organizers who were voicing these things?
I think so. There's a lot of abolitionist organizing going on in Washington County, where U of M is located. And I don't want to speak for those organizers. I think those organizers are brilliant, and it was really huge development in the strike when sort of we started working with them and building up a coalition with them, and we hope to continue that work moving forward. I think there is sort of local history that informs this. I think one, the University of Michigan um, is white for a number of institutional and legal practices. I think unions in the state of Michigan are white,
Mhm.
or tend to be whiter because of right to work. So it creates this um, economic pressure that sort of leads for more affluent students who feel like they're sort of to be more capable of giving time and giving funds to a union, which is another problem with right to work.
Yeah.
Um, I think local history, okay, so like in the response to the pandemic, instead of actually improving testing, the University of Michigan increased policing. They set out this Michigan Ambassadors program, which thankfully is over. I mean, I'm sure they'll figure out a way how to like, expand policing on campus in light of the sort of end of that program. But what the Michigan Ambassadors program did was it paid students to police other students with at first armed and then unarmed security person patrolling behind them. And it's really unnerving when one of the regents is like going from picket line to picket line, trying to do a PR tour with these Michigan ambassadors. And you just see this DPSS officer behind him. So there was that sort of initial history, sort of like very recent. There's also the murder of Aura Rosser in 2014. And I think that memory really lingers and hangs over sort of policing in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, because the police chief at the time is now in charge of COVID enforcement policies at the university.
Mm.
So I think those two pieces really were major stories that we told during the strike to show the interconnectedness of our policing demands and our COVID demands.
Right, and not just that, but also the intersection of the university and the community or the region. Absolutely. So you have mentioned a couple times already that you are prioritizing, or during the strike began to prioritize coalition with community groups. I'm assuming outside the university, not just within. So what kind of work went into building trust and collaboration and coalition? And how do you plan to sustain that going forward now that the strike is concluded?
Again, it comes back to the rank and file. Again, it, the reason we were able to have to sort of start building, or in hopes of building, a coalition, right? Like I'm reticent to call it a coalition because we're still not sure whether or not a coalition exists or they'll have us. But sort of bringing in other abolitionist groups into the strike and sort of trying to center and highlight their work came out of rank and file organizers already having built those relationships. And sort of their willingness to sort of bring individuals into this movement, as it's been called by others, but into the strike more generally. So yeah, so we really sort of benefited from having rank and file who were already involved in abolitionist organizing. Mm-hmm. And we're still trying to figure out how to support the community moving forward. I think sort of the coalitional work is very important to us, but we're still unsure and still talking about ways in which we can do that and sort of support just general organizing in Washtenaw County.
Cool. That sounds like a lot of work, but a very inspiring work for sure. And essential, I think, for the way the labor movement is going to relate to other forms of social movement organizing for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the dynamics of the strike and organizing and sort of its development or organic development. So you mentioned that Michigan has a history of 2-day work stoppages. But when was the last time that there was a mobilization for a strike beyond that? Had it been a while?
1975.
1975. Wow. So what were some of the challenges, I guess, convincing workers or leadership that the strike was possible at this time and necessary? Because you mentioned how this was a rank and file development, but I don't assume that means all the rank and file were ready to strike. How did these conversations sort of develop over time?
So I think so here's the lead up to the strike. This is one way of viewing it and one way of narrating it, which is we started collecting work stoppage pledges about 7 weeks before the strike. We should have started these pledges like 2 months, 3 months in advance, because it takes a while. And some people were not interested, and some people we didn't know we didn't know the level of interest because we didn't actually have numbers on our bargaining unit. So that was another barrier we faced. I think going into the week before the strike occurred, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not we would hit our mobilization necessary, but there were certain events on campus that made it seem like a strike in the second week would be effective. The faculty announced a vote of no confidence in the administration. We started hearing rumors about issues with housing on campus and general treatment of undergraduates that we found to be extremely unnerving, and also indicate that sort of we should show leadership as an organization and sort of make the first step towards fighting against these reopening policies. So I think the Friday 2 weeks before the strike, we got all that new information, and that led the leadership to announce a unanimous recommendation for a strike. So even though we didn't have the mobilization we were targeting, it really came down to seeing other organizations and the just general atmosphere on campus being sort of strike ready.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the other thing to mention is we overcame, going into the strike, we did not know we would have enough picketers, right? So we typically when you set up a strike, you start calling people for picket shifts like a week or two in advance, right? You schedule that. We thankfully figured out a way how to use Google Forms to auto schedule people. But we got 700 picket shift signups and scheduled them in one day. And again, planning and processing for the strike sort of was very rushed because it came down to the fact that it became clear it would be viable a week out. And so while we had done a lot of the pre-work, the actual sort of strategy was very much very last minute. I think the organizers of this union would be very open about how sort of last minute and let's just keep it at last minute.
Yeah.
These conversations were.
So with these strike-ready conversations or trying to get these pledges, I'm sure there were a lot of concerns for people in terms of their security and the risks that they were going to have to take if they went on strike. What kinds of challenging conversations were you having with workers? What were some of their hesitancy or concerns about what kind of risk they would take to make this a successful strike? And were you able to change some minds who initially might have been a little resistant to the idea of going on strike?
I think it's hard. I had some conversations with people who were unsure. And I think before the strike, it was difficult to get people on board because they felt like there would be significant pushback. They were afraid they would lose their jobs. They were nervous that we wouldn't win what we wanted to, what we did. They didn't think we would make progress on our demands. And they also didn't think we were mobilized enough, right? And all of those were concerns going into this, right? Those were all reasonable concerns. I think the conversations and the concerns of workers changed over the course of the strike. I think it became, I don't want to say easier, but changed after we rejected the offer, because then the conversation became, look, if we don't continue the strike, they're just going to retaliate and we'll lose jobs. But beforehand, it was all about this. It really, what I found helped the most was sort of explaining various cases we heard of people being sort of pressured into working in person that the university kind of left out. Like the university would say, oh, no one's being pressured. But then you hear this case of two instructors. They're told one position is in person, the other is online. And the person chose to work in person because the other individual in that class was pregnant at the time. So they didn't really have that much of a choice because it was either them or their colleague who is high risk for a serious reaction to COVID-19. But the university, everyone's being accommodated. So I thought those stories and really sort of saying like, look, you're fighting for your colleagues here, for me at least, in my organizing conversations, sort of moved the needle. I think the conversations we had around the Wednesday general membership meeting when we rejected the initial offer, the conversation, at least the argument I made, was that we knew what was going to happen if we accepted the offer, right? Michigan has a long history of 2-day work stoppages. We know if we took that offer, it would just be a continuation of that. And I think at that point, at least the people I had conversations with were willing to see what happened if we rejected it.
Yeah, so it seems like in the middle of following just how the strike was developing, more people felt either, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but inspired or moved or mobilized to join in because of the importance of some of the things you're demanding. It kind of reminds me of at Harvard when we struck in December of 2019, which feels like years ago now. How we didn't expect we'd be on strike for a month, and yet as the weeks went by, we felt like there was different kinds of energy entering and different ideas for how to picket. And different people who weren't striking week 1 to week 2 were like, oh, this seems like this is really important for me to do at this moment. So definitely relate to that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about these developments that I was following on Twitter during the duration of your strike, which I was just amazed at how large your general membership meetings were at the end of each day. So you said Wednesday was sort of like a peak participation because of the relevance of discussing the demands or the deal that was going to be ultimately rejected. But how did you keep that energy going? How did you get thousands of people or hundreds of people at a time to come to these meetings? And was it just happening and you just had to deal with it and let's talk about this? Or was there some kind of coordination in having to keep up membership democracy in that way?
See, it's a hard question because it was extremely surprising at the time. So I'm not going to pretend like we had a sense of like, oh yeah, this is going to be 1,200 people, no questions asked. I think a lot of it came down to the amount of work our communications team did and the work of our organizers and our department stewards. And I think a lot of that work is relatively or less visible than sort of in-person picketing. But I think when the stakes are high, people showed up. And I think we had nearly all of our members showing up, in part because they were energized around these demands, but also because, someone told me, look, like some of these people aren't here because they agree with what we're doing. They're here because they're worried about whether or not they're going to be teaching tomorrow morning. So I think that's an interesting element. We also had, I think, close to 1,400 at the second GMM. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of energy. I think it came down to having a great communications committee and also having a good virtual picket line and having really good organizers on the ground.
Yeah. So another thing I noticed about your strike was how it sort of had this domino effect. Resident advisors ended up going on strike. Dining hall workers slowed down. Construction workers, I think, stepped off maybe one of these days, if I'm remembering correctly. How did these conversations happen, or was it did the action happen first and then discussions afterwards, or was there any sense of one strike or one action building off of one another?
I think it's the latter. I think, again, it came through personal connections through the rank and file, and it sort of, I remember having conversations at base camp where it was just all these news, all the information about these different strikes were coming together, and you could sort of see like bits and pieces. And the resident advisors, I mean, an M dining, undergraduate workers going on strike or doing a work slowdown in the case of M dining, extremely brave. I don't think as an undergrad I would have been able to sort of pull off what they did. And the university really, really failed the
Yeah.
res life. I mean, they were putting these kids in rooms with positive COVID-19 patients and like telling them to sort of do the work healthcare providers should be doing with no oversight, and putting them in dorms without sheets or food. Like, on one hand, I want to say like perhaps GEO's leadership affected that, but I mean, there's a lot of like student leadership involved here. And I really don't want to minimize that. Again, with sort of the Michigan advisors, I'm sorry, the push to end the Michigan Ambassadors Program started with the Students of Color Liberation Front, which is a group of, in the past they were been referred to as multicultural organizations, who realized that they really needed, or who got sick of sort of their role and their sort of tokenist inclusion in these campus groups, and started fighting for a Michigan Ambassadors Program and really led the way with that. So like, as much as like I think the GEO strike created a organizing space that was really useful, I really don't want to minimize like the undergraduate leadership that sort of has led to significant progress on some of these demands.
Yeah, yeah. So actions on different fronts for sure. I want to talk a little bit about the administration about all this and how you engage them. So what were some of the strategies in countering some of these explicit attempts to break your strike? The intimidation, maybe faculty resistance, claims of this being an illegal strike, the injunction hearing. It was just on and on every day. There seemed to be some new form of strike breaking involved here.
Absolutely. At the same time, our comms team is better than Michigan's comms team. So it was like, right? So it was like one of those things where we would be hit with threats and sort of these like PR narratives that were easy to poke holes through, right? And like they're narratives we've seen before, where sort of a community, we need to stick together, your strike is letting undergraduates down. So I think there was a public response that was important. We also were mindful of how those threats impacted our members, and part of our way of responding to that was through, standard labor organizing inoculation, sort of reaching out to department stewards, having them contact their members, making sure that sort of anyone who had questions about retaliation could talk with our grievance team, and our grievance team could sort of help them out or make sure that their questions were answered. Another strategy that we employed was through symbolic pickets. So when the School of Social Work threatened retaliation against their students, we picketed in front of their building for a couple of days, and then by the end of it, they sent out a letter of support. So I think that sort of shows that in response to threats, there's sort of external work that needs to be done, internal work that helps support it, and then also that just on the ground action is also an important part of that strategy.
Right. So ultimately, you agreed to a deal. Now that there's been a few days of distance between those events, what do you think you achieved with that deal, and what is still lacking? What needs to be addressed with future organizing?
So I think it's important that we talk about the fact that sort of the injunction and us not taking that deal would have ended the union. So we had a hearing the next day, which would have next day, possibly day after, that would have led to our strike being declared illegal, and we would have lost all of our bargaining power.
Mhm.
And that would have led to us being retaliated against. It would have led likely to us, because we had no other option, we would have continued to go on strike, and we would have been hit with contempt of court, which would have not only come with its own fines, but the university was suing us for damages. And we were fairly certain that we caused enough obstruction that they could feasibly sue us out of existence. So the main win there is that, like, we have a union, we still have a union, we can sort of support our students, we can still file grievances, we can support workers. I think having the Michigan Ambassadors program ended was huge. Again, don't want to claim that victory. I think the Students of Color Liberation Front deserve claiming that victory, but I think organizationally, it's a victory that sort of we were able to step up and support them. I think we did win some increase in the childcare subsidy. So I think we did increase support for parents. We did increase support for international students. We have a new member at the International Center, and they're working on the phone line, which isn't much, but it's something. We have this like really bureaucratic process of opting out that basically gives someone a 50% chance of being able to work remotely after sort of going through a process, which isn't great, but it's not nothing. And maybe there'll be some timeline extensions, but we're not optimistic about that. And policing, we have a task force. Again, task forces they are not known for their effectiveness. But I think we're optimistic that sort of we can organize around the task force and sort of use that possibly to gain some information or sort of further our organizing moving forward. So I think really what we're seeing this is a big lesson in how to run a strike, and also at least charting a way forward for the next 2 years before our next contract campaign. So again, it's not much, but I think we also want some transparency stuff. But again, the transparency stuff was them just announcing they don't have a plan. So, yeah.
So knowing what you know now, what's one thing that you would have done differently during the lead up or the execution of the strike? I guess as leadership, I would ask.
There's so many things. Again, there's so many things.
Yeah.
I think for any graduate union, what I would recommend is figure out the unions that work on campus and around campus and support them. Show up to their strikes, show up to events, donate, do what you can so you can build those bonds, so when you need help, they're willing to step up. And I mean, the problem we face as grad student unions is that teachers unions have a history of not respecting picket lines. At least in Michigan. At least that's my experience talking with the building trades in Washtenaw County. Mm-hmm. So I think it's up to us, if we hope for them to respect our picket lines, we need to show that we're not going to cross theirs, we're actually going to join them. So I would say that that's, if I were to offer one piece of advice, it would be that. There's also a discussion of sort of like, how do we communicate strategies and allow for a diversity of tactics during a strike in a way that is based in consensus. But I really want to sort of highlight and center that lesson in labor organizing and labor outreach.
That's very important. One sector depends on another sector of workers, absolutely, especially on campuses. Especially on campuses. So, on a final note, do you have any other concluding thoughts that you want to share with organizers and workers at other public institutions facing right to work, organizing a strike in a right to work state, or even workers at private universities, private institutions facing a different set of challenges?
That's a hard question. That's a pretty big question. I think the reason why this strike worked, and it's important that we recognize that this strike could have failed, and could have failed in a way that left workers at the University of Michigan worse off. I think the reason this strike worked is because participants in this strike stepped up. And I think we also received support from labor groups in the area. I think one thing that was important for this strike was emergent systems that built up over the course of the strike. And I'm sure you had the similar experience at Harvard during your strike. You know, suddenly the people who were sort of doing one set of tasks figured out a way how to organize another group to sort of oversee those tasks. And you have committees forming that wouldn't have formed before the strike because you had no idea what you needed. So I think the main lesson, or the two lessons again, you can't win a strike without support from other workers. And you need to make space for the rank and file to respond to the challenges on the ground with new strategies and new systems, and figuring out a way how to get buy-in from members and sort of communicate with the organization in such a way that adapting to the situation is done as an organization effectively and sort of mind towards consensus. Was that okay? Was that coherent? Okay.
That was a lot. It's a great answer. Yeah, well, on behalf of Harvard's grad student workers, thanks for sharing all this insight. We were definitely following the strike very closely. We're very excited to see how things develop. And I'm sure I'm not speaking just for our union, but many other unions across the country. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with The Forge.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.